Recently seen some NHL trades involving some pretty bad NHL contracts. Now that those moves have occurred, who would we consider to be the worst contracts that many feel would be untradeable? I'll give you my top 5 list coming up next. Welcome back here to Top Shelf Hockey. Now today's video is based on an article I came across through the Hockey News discussing the top 10 contracts around the NHL they felt were untradeable. After reading the article, I didn't entirely agree with their entire list, so I've kind of made my own adjustments here and kind of changed things to have a top 5 that I feel are the most untradeable contracts. But of course, in the NHL, we never say never. We've seen some pretty bad contracts that we thought were impossible to be traded actually end up being traded. So I'm not going to say it's completely impossible, but these are the most unlikely, most difficult trades to be made around the league. Let's get started here with Justin Abdelkader of the Detroit Red Wings. Now, Abdelkader still has 4 years left on his contract at $4.25 million. He's 32 years old, soon to be 33 when the NHL season gets underway. Justin Abdelkader's never been a big offensive player. He's only scored 20 goals on one occasion. He's hit the 40-point plateau on 2 separate occasions. But for the majority of his career, he's been a role player, a guy who's played in the bottom 6, provided some speed, a little bit of grit. Certainly looked upon as somewhat of a leader on that team. But that Red Wings team, especially in his early days, had a lot of guys who could provide leadership. But he certainly became one of them over time as well. But this contract, in my opinion, has not really aged overly well. I've never been a big fan of it from the get-go because of the term. Last season we saw things deteriorate even further where he only put up 19 points, and given where he's at in his career, there's certainly no reason to expect things to turn around and to get better. The Detroit Red Wings are going through a rebuild, and to have contracts like this on their books right now certainly slows things down, in my opinion. It takes away a roster spot. It also ties up a lot of salary cap space that they could be putting into some younger players that very well might help accelerate this rebuild. You get another guy on this team who did make the list because of the term, but like Darren Helm received a contract from the Red Wings, kind of similar, around the same time as Abdelkader. I didn't put him on this list because he was only given a 5-year term, and he's down to 2 years remaining. But another type of player, a role player, a guy who plays in the bottom 6 and can provide some intangibles, but was never really a very good offensive player. But yet we're given long-term deals here by the Red Wings, so deals that I was not overly fond of. They've also got Franz Nielsen as well, who's I believe 35 now and has I think 3 or 4 years remaining. So it's also another unfavorable contract with the Red Wings. And these are not the only ones. We've seen other ones in the past. Obviously, at one point, Ken Holland was handing out these 7-8 year contracts to a lot of guys on the team that they had had some success with. But, really, sometimes I think these longer-term deals and more lucrative contracts with the no moves and no trades really should be kind of reserved for more of the top guys, not necessarily a guy who's looked upon as a decent leader who plays a bottom 6 role. But that's just my opinion. So I'm not real crazy with this Abdelkader contract, and I think if the Red Wings wanted to trade it, it would be pretty close to impossible. Next up, we've got Kyle Okposo of the Buffalo Sabres, who signed as an unrestricted free agent with Buffalo on July the 1st, 2016. July the 1st, 2016, in my opinion, was one of the worst days in NHL for GMs handing out terrible contracts. When you now look back at that free agent class and a lot of the deals that were handed out that day, there was a lot of bad ones and a lot of ones that are on this list or that we've talked about recently or have finally had been traded after a period of time here. It was not a good day for NHL GMs that day at all. There's a lot of players that just did not live up to the hype to these unrestricted free agent contracts. And Okposo is one of them, although I will cut him a little bit of slack. Some of this is due to his injuries and the illnesses that he's battled over the last few years in Buffalo. But it's certainly fair to say that even when he's been healthy, he has not provided the type of offense that they thought they were getting when they signed him as a free agent for the New York Islanders. Now, they also gave him a full no-move clause in the first 2 years of the contract, which has now gone by. And for the remainder of the contract, he's got a modified no-trade where there's a 15-team list that he can veto in any kind of trade request. So that gives him a fair bit of power as well. So not only is the term and the money not favorable based on performance, but now you're kind of handcuffed as well, that you're very limited on where you can trade it. So I'm personally, like I said, I'm not a big fan of some of these clauses and longer terms given out to players that, in my opinion, are not necessarily like a top echelon type of player. He's been a good player in his career, had a pretty solid NHL resume, but really probably topping out at a second line player, certainly not necessarily somebody who's kind of looked upon as being irreplaceable. Now, in Okposo's case here, his offensive numbers were down last year for the third consecutive season. Like I said, a couple of years ago, he had a lot of injury and health issues, but a lot of that seems to be resolved. He's played more of a full schedule the last 2 years, and the numbers just are not coming up. They're going down, which is very typical of somebody at his age, in the stage he's at in his career. But this 7-year, $42 million contract given to Okposo on July 1st, 2016 right now has not aged well, and I think they'd have a really difficult time trying to move it at this point. Next up, we have Andrew Ladd of the New York Islanders, who's another one of those July 1st, 2016 deals, who signed as an unrestricted free agent, leaving the Winnipeg Jets. He was their former captain, signing a 7-year contract extension with the New York Islanders. At the time of the contract, Ladd was 30 years old. He's 33 today. He will be turning 34 during the coming season. And again, just another case where I don't think players that are 30, 31 years old should be given 7 or 8 year contracts. It's really high risk. They're at the stage of the career already where players start to decline. And even if the first year or so goes well, it's bound not to age well. And by the time you're at the worst case, maybe halfway through, it's going to be looked upon as really unfavorable for sure. And Ladd is no exception here. I know in the last year or so, he's really battled a lot of injuries. He's missed a lot of time. It's another thing, though, that comes with getting a little bit older, as well as your bodies start to break down, especially if you're a guy like Ladd, who's played a pretty physical style game of hockey. You know, once you hit 30 years old, you get a lot of miles on there, and it's just bound to start happening a little bit more as you get a little bit older. So this was a really bad deal from the get-go from the Islanders, in my opinion. His first year with the Islanders wasn't too bad. He scored 23 goals, but he didn't really get very many assists. Only had a little bit over 30 points, so really not great considering what he's getting paid. And then the last 2 years, the offense has dropped even further. And like I said, there's been over 65 missed games due to injuries here. So I don't see things getting better for Andrew Ladd. Obviously, when you're at that age, the injuries are that much harder on you. They're that much harder for you to recover and regain your old form. And this is bound to be a bad contract for the Islanders as long as he's there. He has 4 years left on the contract. Now, a lot of these contracts are front-loaded, and Ladd's is no different, but still with 4 years left, this is going to be a negative impact on the Islanders' cap situation for quite some time. Next up, we've got Louis Eriksson of the Vancouver Canucks. Now, I know this won't come as any surprise. He's been a player that's been talked about a lot recently. Obviously, he signed a 6-year, $6 million per year contract with the Canucks. Again, another group of this 2016 free agent class. At the time, he was 31 years of age, so giving a guy that much term at that age just seems a little bit crazy, but he was coming off a pretty solid 30-goal campaign with the Boston Bruins the year before. He had been used to putting up, had multiple 70-plus point seasons playing with the Dallas Stars. When he first went to Boston, his numbers did dip down, but then he slowly kind of regained his form, and during his 3 years in Boston, steadily improved each year, finishing with a 30-goal campaign. But still, that was the only year out of the 3 where he really came close to putting up the type of numbers that he was used to doing with the Stars previously to that. But as long as he's been with Vancouver, it's been that much more of a dramatic decline in his offensive numbers. We've seen recently during this offseason where he had a lot of remarks to a Swedish media outlet kind of indicating his displeasure with the Canucks and how he wasn't getting along with the coach, didn't like how he was being used, complaining about his ice time and all that. So things certainly went from bad to worse. It was bad enough his production was down, but then to be that disgruntled about it. But really, at the end of the day, if you don't perform well, how can you expect to be put in more favorable positions on the ice, get power play time, get top line minutes? Like, that's not going to be given to you if you don't get the job done and you aren't producing when you're given the opportunity here. So Louis Eriksson's time in Vancouver very well might continue, and it might be done. It's hard to say. He's a player that's been mentioned in trade rumors all offseason long. He was linked to Edmonton with Milan Lucic going back the other way. Obviously, that never came to be, and we later found out that they really weren't all that close to making it happen. Of course, Lucic went to Calgary for James Neal, who was another player out in Western Canada. That those three were all kind of interlinked at some point over the last few months and maybe being swapped for one another. But obviously, with 2 out of the 3 changing places, that kind of leaves Eriksson in no man's land and unlikely at this point to find a trade for Vancouver. But they're a team that's in desperate need to find some salary cap space, as they need to lock up restricted free agent forward Brock Besser, ideally to a longer-term deal, or even if it's a bridge contract, they're still going to need a fair bit of space to take care of that. And getting rid of this contract would be so much of a huge help to the Canucks. But at this point, can it be moved? Is there a team out there that would take on Louis Eriksson's 3 remaining years at $6 million with declining production and obviously, not the greatest of attitudes? So let me know what you think. Can Louis Eriksson find a new home, or is he going to start the 1920 season in Vancouver? Now, last but not least on my list is Chicago Blackhawks defenseman Brent Seabrook, who's currently 34 years of age, and back in 2015, the year before all the crazy 2016 contracts, he signed a mega contract extension here with the Chicago Blackhawks. At the time, he was 30 years old. He was given an 8-year contract extension worth $55 million. Now, by the time this contract was signed and received by Seabrook from the Blackhawks, they obviously had a lot of success over the number of years prior. 3 Stanley Cups in a 6-year span. They had a lot of success with guys like Seabrook and Keith and Kane and Taves. A lot of these guys were getting rewarded with big-time contracts. Now, for the most part, out of all their bigger-time players who certainly played big roles in those Cup wins, probably you could argue here that Seabrook was probably the least significant of the bunch. You think Patrick Kane, Jonathan Taves, and Duncan Keith, I think there's a fair argument to say that they were more valuable and played a bigger role in all that team success. Not that Seabrook wasn't important, he was, just not to the extent that they were. So to be given an 8-year contract extension at age 30 for $55 million just seems a little bit ridiculous. But at the same time, GMs are trying to work around the salary cap and all the restrictions and all that to kind of fit everybody in. And a lot of these contracts were front loaded, and they knew the last number of years of the contracts likely would have declining play and less value, and certainly proved to be difficult to get rid of should they need to be. But I guess they do what they got to do to keep their players at the time. But this is a contract that certainly is handcuffed Chicago, in my opinion. It's probably the worst contract in the NHL right now and the most difficult to trade, in my opinion. During the first year of the contract, though, he did put up 49 points and actually hit some career highs, which things were looking good, in year 1 of 8, but really ever since then it's been a steady decline. We've even seen times in the last year or so where he's been a healthy scratch, which is the first time that Brent Seabrook's ever gone through that in his career, and it's really difficult to say if he can rebound and get things going again, considering where the stage of his career he's at and his age. But really, like I said, I think this is the most difficult contract to trade right now in the NHL. So could the Chicago Blackhawks actually trade Brent Seabrook? I think it's highly doubtful, but let me know what you think down below. So those are the top 5 contracts. I think they're the worst in the NHL, the most untradeable. There's certainly some other guys around that you could certainly throw in there as honorable mentions. I think it's fair to put like a guy like a Kevin Shattenkirk and Brendan Smith from the New York Rangers. You've got Zach Parise with the Minnesota Wild. I realize that was a contract that's now outlawed. Basically, it was a 13-year contract. He certainly has not been able to live up to the hype in Minnesota. He certainly did have some productive years. He certainly tries real hard. It's not due to a lack of effort, but unfortunately for Parise's sake, it seems like he's been made of glass and just cannot stay healthy. He's missed a ton of time, and that's certainly played a big role. And given the fact that where he's at with his age right now and have so much term left, certainly makes that contract very untradeable as well. The only reason I didn't include it on this list is because of how much of a backdiving contract it is. They very well might be able to get out of that contract with about 2 or 3 years remaining. A buyout at that point of the deal very well might be more feasible than it is right now. If Parise can play another couple seasons and remain somewhat healthy and get decent production, escape that contract a little bit early with a buyout in a couple years' time. So let me know what other contracts you think around the NHL are the most untradeable, and let me know what you think of these guys. Can they be traded? And if so, what would make a logical trade? Where could they possibly end up? If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content. Stay tuned to all the breaking news from around the NHL. We'll keep you all up to date. Thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you next time.